The candles guttered as 300 pairs of eyes turned upon her, and Eleanor Vance felt the laughter before she heard it, a ripple of silk and scorn moving through the ballroom like a cold current beneath ice. "Look at the hem," someone whispered, not quietly enough, "tattered as a beggar's washing." She did not move. She had learned over years of small cruelties that stillness was its own armor. But armor cracks, and tonight, beneath the gilded ceiling of Worthington House, with her grandmother's old gown frayed at the sleeve and mended so many times the thread showed silver in the candlelight, she felt the crack travel all the way to her chest. Then came the silence. It fell so suddenly, so completely, that Eleanor thought for one terrible moment she had fainted, that the world had simply gone quiet around her collapse. But she had not fallen. She had only watched as the Duke of Ashbourne, a man who had not spoken a single unnecessary word to another soul that entire season, a man whose reputation for coldness was spoken of with the same hushed dread as a winter plague, crossed the floor toward her with his jaw set like carved stone. He did not bow. He did not offer some practiced gallantry. He reached for the lapel of his own black velvet vest, and with a single violent motion tore it down the seam. Thread snapped, a button rolled across the marble and disappeared into shadow. Gasps rose around the room like startled birds taking flight. "There," he said, his voice low and even, though something feral burned behind his grey eyes. "Now we match." Eleanor could not breathe. The mockery in the room curdled instantly into something else. Shock, confusion, a terrible, delicious scandal blooming in real time before them all. And she, in her ruined dress, standing beside the Duke in his ruined vest, understood that her life had just been split cleanly into a before and an after. But to understand how she had arrived at that moment, trembling, humiliated, and suddenly, impossibly not alone, one had to go back to a smaller house, a colder hearth, and a girl who had learned far too young what it meant to be unwanted. Eleanor had not always worn mended hems. There had been a time, faint now as a half-remembered dream, when her family's name carried weight in Hertfordshire, when her father's laughter filled rooms instead of debts. But fever had taken him when she was 12, and with him went the steadiness of their fortune. Her mother, never a woman built for hardship, had retreated into a kind of perpetual mourning that left little room for a daughter's grief. It was her aunt, Lady Prudence Harrow, who took her in, not from love but from obligation, the kind that curdles into resentment within a fortnight. Lady Harrow had 2 daughters of her own, Constance and Marigold, both lovely, both cruel in the particular way that only the comfortable can afford to be. They did not strike Eleanor, they were too well bred for that. Instead, they wielded smaller, sharper weapons, the seating arrangement that placed her nearest the draught, the gown accidentally left too long for alteration, the invitations that arrived addressed only to Miss Harrow and family, as though Eleanor were a piece of furniture not worth naming. She grew skilled at invisibility. She learned to mend her own clothes by candlelight after the household slept, her fingers growing calloused at the paths from needle and thread. She learned to keep her chin level even when her stomach twisted with hunger, even when Constance borrowed her one good shawl and never returned it. She learned most painfully that kindness shown to her was rare enough to be suspicious, and so when it came, a stable boy's quiet gift of bread, and old governess's lingering hand on her shoulder, she hoarded it like a miser hoards coin, turning it over in her mind during the loneliest hours. It was at her aunt's insistence that she attended the season's gatherings at all, not for Eleanor's benefit, but because a poor relation present at every ball made the family's charity visible, a performance of generosity that cost Lady Harrow nothing and flattered her vanity considerably. Eleanor understood this. She understood, too, that she was meant to fade into the wallpaper, to be seen just enough to prove the family's Christian goodness, and no more. She had not expected to be seen by him. The Duke of Ashbourne, Julian Thorne, though few dared use his given name, had inherited his title young, after a carriage accident that had taken both his parents in a single winter night. Society whispered that the accident had taken something else from him too, his warmth, his patience, whatever softness that had once lived behind those grey eyes. He attended functions because duty demanded it, stood at the edges of rooms with a glass of brandy he rarely drank, and left before the dancing grew too lively. Mothers paraded their daughters before him with the desperate hope of a ducal match, and he regarded each performance with the same flat, unreadable expression, as though watching rain fall on a window he had no intention of opening. He had noticed Eleanora 3 weeks prior at the Castleford musical, though she did not know it. She had been standing near the refreshment table, not eating. She rarely ate at these events, too proud to let anyone see how genuinely hungry she was, watching the dancers with an expression that was not envy exactly, but something quieter and sadder. A longing not for the dance itself, but for the ease of belonging that the dancers wore so carelessly, the way one wears a coat without thinking of its warmth. He had watched her watch them, and when Marigold Harrow made some careless remark about charity cases within Eleanora's hearing, loud enough to be cruel and quiet enough to be deniable, he had seen the flinch Eleanora suppressed so quickly that anyone less attentive would have missed it entirely. He had not forgotten it. The night of the Worthington ball, Eleanora had known, the moment she descended from the carriage, that something was wrong with her gown. The hem, mended a dozen times already, had finally begun to fray beyond repair, a thread pulling loose with every step. She had no funds for a new dress, no time to properly fix the old one, and no choice but to attend regardless. Lady Harrow had made attendance a condition of Eleanora's continued lodging, framed with such false sweetness that refusal was never truly an option. She had hoped, foolishly, that the candlelight and the crush of the crowd might disguise the worst of it. She had hoped wrong. The mockery began before she had even crossed the ballroom's threshold properly. Constance saw the hem first, and made a small delighted sound, the sound of a cat spotting a wounded bird. Within minutes, the whisper had travelled the room with the efficiency of wildfire, gathering embellishment as it went. She had stolen the dress from a servant, someone said. No, she had worn it deliberately for sympathy, said another, each version crueler and more inventive than the last. By the time the dancing paused and the room's attention settled fully upon her, standing alone near the edge of the floor in her threadbare gown, the laughter was no longer contained to whispers. It rose, bright and cutting, and Eleanora felt herself shrinking inward, felt the old familiar instinct to disappear taking hold of her spine. And it was in that exact moment, the precise second when humiliation threatened to fold her in half, that the Duke of Ashbourne crossed the floor. He had been watching her from across the room the entire evening, his jaw tightening with each fresh ripple of laughter, his grip on his brandy glass growing white-knuckled. He recognized the particular shape of her suffering because he had worn a version of it himself in the months after the accident, when grief had made him strange, and society had whispered about him too, in drawing-rooms not unlike this one. He knew what it cost to stand still beneath the weight of public scorn. He knew also what it meant when no one came to stand beside you. So he came. He set down his glass without ceremony. He crossed the floor with a stride that made the crowd part instinctively, the way water parts before a ship's hull. And when he reached her, he did not offer comfort in words. Words, he had learned, were too easily disbelieved, too easily dismissed as mere gallantry. Instead, he tore his own vest. The violence of the gesture stunned the room into silence more thoroughly than any speech could have. Velvet, expensive and pristine, ripped open at the seam by his own hands, exposing the white linen beneath. He did it deliberately,
methodically, his eyes never leaving hers, as though daring anyone present to find humor in matching ruin when it belonged to a duke rather than an orphaned girl. "There," he said again, louder now so the whole room might hear it clearly. "Now we match. Perhaps someone might explain to me which of us looks more foolish." No one answered. No one dared. He offered her his arm, not his hand, his arm, the formal gesture of escort, of protection, of public claim, and after a heartbeat of stunned hesitation, Eleanora took it. Her fingers trembled against the torn velvet. She could feel his heartbeat through the fabric, steady despite the chaos he had just created, and something in that steadiness anchored her own racing pulse. "You did not have to do that," she whispered for his ears alone. "No," he agreed, "I did not have to. I chose to." The distinction, she would later understand, meant everything.
The days following the Worthington ball moved like a fever dream. Society, ever hungry for spectacle, could not stop speaking of it. The brooding duke and the tattered debutante, the torn velvet and the silence that had followed. Some called it madness, some called it the most romantic thing witnessed in a decade. Lady Harrow, mortified that her household had become the center of such talk, alternated between fury at Eleanora and desperate attempts to claim credit for raising her. But Julian Thorne was not finished. 3 days after the ball, he called upon the Harrow residence formally, an event so significant that Lady Harrow nearly fainted at the announcement, certain he had come to court Constance or Marigold. Instead, he asked, with the same flat composure he wore like armor, to speak with Eleanora alone. What he said to her in that drawing room, with its draughty windows and threadbare carpet that mirrored her own circumstances so precisely, was not a declaration of love, not yet. It was something quieter, and in its way more devastating. He told her that he had watched her for weeks, had watched her hunger and her pride war against each other in every gathering, had watched her mend her own dignity night after night with the same careful stitches she used on her gowns. He told her that he recognized in her a particular kind of strength that society mistook for weakness simply because it did not announce itself loudly. "I am not a kind man," he said. "Ask anyone in London. They will tell you I am cold, that grief hollowed something out of me years ago that never grew back. But I find in your presence that I do not wish to be cold. I find that I would tear every garment I own before I would watch you stand alone again." Eleanora wept, not delicately, not in the practiced manner of drawing-room sentiment, but fully, the tears of a girl who had spent years swallowing every emotion that might inconvenience someone else. He did not look away from it. He did not flinch from her rawness the way her family always had. He simply waited, patient as stone, until she had finished, and then he offered her his handkerchief with the same solemnity he might have offered a treaty. Lady Harrow's fury when she learned the true nature of the Duke's intentions was a thing of cold magnificence. She had spent years treating Eleanora as a burden to be managed, a debt to be quietly serviced through minimal kindness and maximal control, and now that burden was poised to outrank her entirely. Constance and Marigold, who had built their seasons around securing exactly this kind of match, could do nothing but watch with bitter, helpless envy as the cousin they had mocked for her tattered hem prepared to become a duchess. But Julian was not finished delivering consequences. At the next gathering where the Harrow family appeared, the very next assembly, in fact, scheduled with what Eleanora suspected was deliberate timing, he made a point of publicly crediting Eleanora's character before the same crowd that had laughed at her weeks prior. He spoke of her resilience, her quiet dignity, her refusal to let cruelty diminish her, in tones cool enough to be devastating to anyone who had participated in that earlier mockery. He did not name the Harrows directly. He did not need to. Every eye in the room understood precisely who had authored Eleanora's suffering and precisely who now stood humbled by their own daughter's failed schemes. It was, Eleanora thought, watching her aunt's composure crack into something brittle and desperate, a more elegant justice than any shouted accusation could have achieved.
Their wedding,
When it came that autumn was a quiet affair by the standards of dukedoms. Julian had no patience for spectacle, and Eleonora had spent enough years being stared at to want anything less than necessary attention. But the gown she wore was without a single frayed thread, without a single mended seam, cut from silk the color of dawn breaking over still water. And pinned at her shoulder, in a gesture only the two of them fully understood, was a small scrap of black velvet, salvaged against all reason from the vest he had torn that night at Worthington House. A reminder, he told her, as they stood together afterward in the quiet of Ashbourne's long gallery, candlelight flickering gold across old family portraits that had once watched a lonelier man pace these same halls. That the worst moment of your life became the night I finally stopped pretending I felt nothing. Eleonora touched the velvet scrap at her shoulder, feeling its worn softness beneath her fingers, and thought of all the nights she had mended her own dignity alone in the dark, never once imagining that someone might tear apart their own perfection simply to stand beside her ruin. "And if you hadn't?" she asked softly. "If you had stayed silent like everyone else?" He turned to face her fully, his grey eyes losing for once every trace of the coldness society had assigned him. "Then I would have spent the rest of my life," he said, "being the kind of man who let you stand alone. I find I could not bear to be that man, not when standing beside you felt, for the first time in years, like coming home." Outside, the autumn wind moved through Ashbourne's ancient oaks, and somewhere beyond the windows the world continued exactly as it always had, full of small cruelties and smaller kindnesses, of mended hems and torn velvet, of girls who learned to disappear and the rare, fierce souls who refused to let them. But within that gallery, in the hush of candlelight and old portraits, two people who had each known the particular loneliness of being unseen finally allowed themselves to be seen fully, flaws, mended seams, torn velvet and all, and found in that seeing something neither had dared call hope until it was already theirs to keep.